Welcome to Decoding Grief with Andrew and Gary, where we explore the complex and often messy journey of grief, highlighting the different ways in which individuals experience and process grief. So let's get started.
Welcome to Decoding Grief, our first episode today on this podcast. This is a weekly podcast that we talk about grief and the messiness of grief. Now that means through death, through loss of jobs or circumstances. Grief is so many different things. And me and Gary, I'm Andrew, this is Gary. This is our weekly podcast, and we get to discuss these kind of things because we've both lived these kind of things and talked about these kind of things. It's how we kind of have shared our experiences together.
Yeah.
And definitely how I now work in the medical field after my grief. And what happened was I got to talk to people, got to talk to volunteers and different individuals in my years of working, and kind of saw that in my grief, everyone else, other people had the same grief as I did, or similar grief and had similar experiences like I did. And we thought, there isn't really a podcast that is discussing those things.
Yeah.
The hard things, the tough circumstances afterwards, the events afterwards. And this is kind of that. We dive into those kind of hard discussions.
Yeah, and I've experienced a number of grief things from loss of both parents and 18 years apart, and 16, 18 years apart. And also other grief episodes that were really business related, challenges at work, and different things that were losses or shocks, if you will. And I remember when the first major event for me that I remember was my mother's passing. And I remember people telling me that, oh, you're going to go into a fog for about a year. Yeah. And I thought, no, I'm just fine. And then sure enough, a year later, I realized I'm emerging from this fog. Somehow my life was different after my mother passed, and then I was able to really work through that and spend time with my dad. I don't say it ever goes away,
right?
But yeah, and so I think that people that are listening to this will find value in hearing other people talk about it, because we don't like to talk about it.
Correct.
And I, as you said earlier, it's messy.
Yeah.
And not that we're going to be providing any kind of therapeutic answers to anything. We might have some guests on who are therapists or work in roles where they're able to counsel people, and they're either from a theological perspective or actually a medical perspective, able to help people. And but this one is just really just about us talking about it, having some guests on, and hearing what their grief story was like, and how they found some sort of solace or comfort as they move through it. Yeah. And perhaps that'll be helpful to somebody else who's just listening to the podcast.
Yeah. So my grief was 3 years ago. My mom was diagnosed with cancer, kind of out of nowhere. And because of that, and 3 months later, she passed away. I always say that we kind of never got used to her having cancer. It was diagnosis to a quick, downslide until her passing. And
how long was that?
So she got diagnosed in August of that year, and she passed away in October.
Oh, wow.
I know someone today was like, that's like 8 to 12 weeks. And it was like, it didn't even feel like that. It felt so fast and so quick that I personally was like, you kind of just jumped on the roller coaster and just continued. It wasn't, you never got an opportunity to sit and think about it and take a breath and realize what was happening, or realize how your life was about to change. And it was more like, let's just make sure she's happy. Let's just make sure she's safe. Let's just make sure she's, passing in the way that she wants to pass. And that's the rush at the end. It was like, let's just make sure she's, comfortable and all that kind of stuff.
So you're a bit preoccupied with making her comfortable at the end, where there wasn't time to think about it for you.
Right.
Like, how am I processing this?
Yeah.
How's my dad processing this?
Yeah.
How are my other siblings processing this?
Right.
There's really not time for that. You're focused on your mom and this imminent demise, and how will that be? And we just want her to be happy.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And like after that, it was, I've said this before, that like the first year afterwards, I felt like I have to be strong for everybody else. So I have to be strong for my wife. I have to be strong for my daughter. I have to be strong for my father, for my family. I have to be strong for everyone else. Because everyone else, you know, if you've gone through grief or you've experienced grief, you know the kind of, I like to say, like the BS questions you got afterwards. It was like, oh, how's your dad doing? He must be doing better now. Like, it's been a couple weeks or this. Or how's your, how's your family doing? It's been a little bit, like, it should get better and stuff like that. You know, I share that with a lot of people who are going through grief, and they're like, oh yeah, I didn't like that either. I didn't like those kind of conversations and stuff like that. But I felt like I had to be strong for everyone else. So it didn't really hit me, I felt like, until the next year.
And that's not, I don't think that's unusual.
Yeah.
I think the role we play in our lives, and in others' lives, we feel like we have to be a certain way for them.
Right.
And yeah. And I've heard people talk about in the past that they, as you say, they got to be strong for their family, and the worst thing their family could see is for you to not have every answer and be in control and know where we're headed and know all these things, and there's not time for you to really, in front of other people, deal with these feelings. You have to hide them. I remember when my mom passed, that I had to go to a music festival. I was judging this music festival. Yeah. She passed on a Thursday morning at 1 a.m. And my flight was, I had to go to something out of town 3 hours away on Thursday night, come back, and then fly out on Friday for the weekend to do this judging event. And I remember sitting in the airport thinking I was just fine, and my mother was being cremated, so she wouldn't have wanted her passing to disrupt anyone's life. And so, I went on about my business, and a lot of people were shocked that I was doing that. But I found myself at the airport just overwhelmed with, oh, I'm finally by myself. No one else is around, just these anonymous people in the airport. And I just had to go in the men's room and just like have a grief moment. Right. But I didn't want to burden everyone else in the waiting area, waiting for the flight, or thinking something's wrong with me, or this is, coming over, and I just didn't want that to happen. And I remember how much better it was to go do that. But she had been dying for a year. And so here was the culmination 2 days later of, okay, now, like, how are you can't keep pushing it away. Like, it was inevitable. And then it finally happened. And so searching, I remember the struggle searching for how I can, in a healthy way, process this. I think was my biggest struggle then. Right. And then future things, of course, I learned from that event. Not that everything was perfect, but how do you process then once you got through that? What did you learn to be able to handle the next one? But then the next one's different, totally different, right? Whether it's another parent passing, which happened, or it's some sort of challenge in the workplace, a lawsuit, some sort of challenge that you just didn't even expect. Yeah.
Do you feel like the experiences in the earlier grief, like you were able to kind of gain some tools in those other grief to help in those things, or those things were just, every grief is different and I have to kind of, I don't know, receive it or attack it in a different way because of maybe who it was, or because a job thing was different?
Yeah, I think I think in all of them so far, I was afraid. I think there was fear involved in that, and not knowing what to expect next, not knowing how to adjust to the new normal, and the really
in both parents. In both parents, different fears?
Yeah, afterwards? Because my father was dying over the course of well, his dementia kicked in, and it was probably 8 to 10 years of just steady decline with dementia, and then being bedridden. And my normal was to go visit him and take care of him. He was in a nursing home, but going to visit him was always part of my day. And then suddenly, when he passed, that part of my day was no longer there. So I felt an obligation. Oh, I can go visit. No, I can't. Not there anymore. And when my mother was sick for that year, the normal was to go visit mom. She and my dad were living in a house, and I'd go. We lived in the same area, and part of the normal was to go visit her. And then when that ended, it was replaced by going to visit my dad to make sure that he was okay. And it was different. So that really started in 2006 after she passed, and then being with dad at various levels until he passed in 21 was the new normal. And it became more and more, as time went on, he needed more care. And it was more of a routine by then for different things, to the point of actually feeding him in the nursing home, going and doing that. And it wasn't like that at the beginning, but it became the new normal. So as I've said, that new normal changed. So I learned some stuff from her passing, some stuff from his passing. I had other challenges. I had a lawsuit, 3 lawsuits that were filed. Details not important, but that was another whole challenge. And the grief of going through being accused of things that were not true, and then having to prove that they weren't, and so that whole process is a different kind of grief. And I found help in looking at various authors who talk about the grief process, the 5 stages of grief, and to learn that those are descriptive and not prescriptive. Just because they go in a certain order doesn't mean that they're clean and you go through that order. There's constant going back to a previous level and working through it again. And
I think that's good. Like the steps, sometimes we feel like, I know I had other people that I've talked to before say, I thought, oh, my grief is different than the other person because I'm not as far along as that person. Or their grief is different than mine because I'm at step 3 and they're at step 5 already. But they lost the same, it's the same amount of time or something like that. And a lot of people think like the steps, it's like, oh, it's going to go like this. And then once I'm done with all the steps, I'm good now. Everything's better. I always say that time heals all wounds, which is such a lie. Like that, what I learned was like, that's just not true. And it's more like a scar that you can continuously see, and it's never going to heal. It's never going to be totally gone. You learn to like live through it or live with it, but it's always there. Like I didn't stop missing my mom after a year because I went through all the steps, or I feel like I went through all the steps. Like, that doesn't stop.
Right, and it was 2006, and here we are in 2024. So we're many years beyond that, and I still have moments of, gosh, I wish I could tell her this thing. Oh, I can't tell her that thing. So now I've gone back into one of the grief stages. Am I angry because I can't talk to her? Am I, what phase am I in again? But I don't think I don't know if the work is ever done. I think, and that's why it's messy. And I think that's the value of at least just talking about it. And I know we've gone to lunch numerous times, and we talk about these things. And I have to believe that there are a lot of other people that are like us, and they're still working through this grief process, whatever it is for them, and they're very different. It may be similar in some ways to ours. Yours is similar to mine in some ways, different in other ways, and just being able to, I think for me, the most helpful was to know that I wasn't alone. That this was a normal process that everyone goes through when they lose something that's important to them. And whether it's a human or a job or a position in their life or some sort of activity they did, whatever, when those things change, I mean, think of people that age out of being able to be really active in sports.
Right.
And they can't do those things that define them.
Yeah.
Can't do them anymore. That's the whole grief process.
Yeah.
And I think learning that we're not alone in that, and I think especially men don't talk about it.
Yeah.
I think we're expected to be the brave little soldier that just goes on, and everybody would their world would be rocked if they knew we were a bit fragile.
Right.
And so that's
don't show emotion.
Oh, well, right.
Don't cry. Don't do those kind of things. And it's like, just recently I have a 5-year-old daughter, and so she was 2 at the time when Mom passed. And it was funny that recently, a couple of days ago, she said to me like, "Dad, I've never seen you cry," and it was like, really, like, you obviously do not remember 3 years ago, because I would cry and I would, but like mine wasn't like I just need to go cry. That wasn't my experience. For me, it would just be sometimes it was like my mom was mentioned or something was coming up, or think like you said, like you just wish you could text them this or send them like something was happening. Like my daughter had a dance recital at like
a happy thing
that
like, you would normally call, and that normal is no longer normal.
Right. Yeah. And those kind of moments, like I get emotional about those kind of things. And like obviously my first instinct is to say like, no, it's okay. Like I'm not gonna do that. I'm not gonna cry. I'm not gonna talk to someone about that, because no one wants to hear that from me. No one wants to hear that, or that's not what
it'll make them sad.
It'll make them sad. Like
so, I don't want them to be sad. So I'm just not going to be sad.
Exactly. And like, what we have learned, like meeting people and talking to people through their grief, it's like, wow, they have those kind of same thoughts and those same experiences. And I've had opportunities to go speak places, and people coming up to us afterwards and saying, like, I could never talk about that, or I could never share about my grief like that.
Yeah.
That's so emotional, or that's something I just don't talk about.
Yeah.
And I just talk, like, me and you met. I work for hospice now. Again, working through my grief, it has been the best for me to work in hospice, which sounds so crazy to me, that because of my mom's passing, I have felt solace in helping other families and helping other patients through their grief and through their like losing a loved one and stuff like that. But I've met volunteers and stuff like that. And how I met you was, one of our nurses saying they had met you years ago and helping your father, and saying, Gary would be a great volunteer one day. And I remember calling you. I hate talking on the phone. Like I always feel like my insecurity is always, this person doesn't want to talk to me on the phone. I'm bothering them at the wrong time, or they're doing something that, they're eating lunch or they're eating dinner or something like that. And I remember calling you, and you don't remember it like this, but I remember it like this, of like who is this person calling me? What is this person? That's always how I feel insecurity. And once I kind of said, one of our nurses, and you knew who our nurse was, and said, oh yeah, he really helped us in my family. And once I kind of shared my heart and my grief, I felt like we became quick friends pretty quickly because of that. I feel like when you go through grief, it's like, oh, you understand where I'm coming from. You understand, we said it before, like you feel plucked out when you experience grief and the whole world keeps going. Mm-hmm. But the people who understand you are the people who also have been plucked out and know how those days feel and those years feel. And your father passed almost very similar to the same time.
Your mom was October, my dad was November.
Absolutely. And so like our grief for that is very similar yearly wise, like time wise. And that has really helped us like, oh, we're kind of on the same wavelength on those kind of things, like that time. Very different at times too. Yeah. But I think that really broke down some walls in the beginning to meet people. And that's what I love. This is why I wanted to do this. I got to do that a lot with other volunteers, kind of sharing my heart, and sharing through my heart, people's walls kind of broke down. I was like, oh, I've experienced that too. Mm-hmm. Like I've had that happen. My father has passed away, or my mother, my brother, or different stories like that. And it's taught me so much. Yeah. And it's like, why do people not talk about this more? Like, this is the stuff I wish I could put on a month after my mom died, a year after my mom died, days after my mom died. Like, oh, this is okay. Like, I'm gonna get through this. Like, what I'm experiencing is
Well, wouldn't it be sad if it was the case where a loved one passes and your relationship was such that you don't hurt from it, that you don't grieve from it, that you don't allow yourself to grieve from it? I don't want to bring people down. They won't understand all that kind of stuff. I remember a friend one time lost an adult child, and she went to he was in 25 or so, and she went to the grocery store, and somebody said to her, "Oh, I haven't seen you here at the store for a few weeks." And she said, "Yeah, our son died." And the person said, "Oh, I know how you must feel." And my friend said, "Oh, have you lost a child before?" And she said, "Well, no." And then she said, "Well, then you have no idea how I feel." And I remember how shocking it was to hear her say that, that she had told that other woman that. But she's right. You know, we say stuff like that, like, "Oh, I know how you must feel." I don't. I have an idea of how it might feel for you grieving for your mom. And you have an idea of how it might feel for me. But we're in totally different places in our lives.
Absolutely.
We're totally different ages. We have totally different family histories. All that's different.
You're like 50 years older than me, right?
You know, like 100 years older than you. So we think that we know what the other person feels like, but we don't. Really, and it's uncharted territory. And I think that through these podcasts that we're going to do, I think people will be able to see the guests that we have and different people that talk about the grief process in their experience, that people may start to find that they are not alone. That it may be similar, not the same. It may not be similar at all, but the feeling is similar. And I think mostly to know that they're not alone.
I mean, we don't want these podcasts to be, you know, just talk about death and the horrible process or the terrible days. And there's some funny stories in the grief, and there's some funny experiences in the grief, and but what I want to learn is from different people's perspective, from religious individuals, like what's their solace in the days after a loved one dies, or what can happen, but also from experiences the total opposite. Maybe you don't have that kind of solace in spirituality or something like that. How does that affect your grief? How does that affect your days afterwards, your years afterwards? Losing a child, how does that change the effect of losing a parent? People have always said to me, like, "Oh, you're probably glad it went so quick and not so long, her cancer." And it was, well, I don't know. I don't know how that would change anything for me. But maybe some other people have those experiences of like, hey, my mom had cancer for many, many years. It was up and down, up and down. How did that change their grief? How did that change their experiences? But also, out of grief, how'd you live life afterwards? How has it grown you? Like, to me, I started working in the medical field. That's something I never thought I would do. That was never in the path for me. And so, like, those open doors, I took that grief and said, let me work through that grief. And help others. Some say, I could never go into hospice again because my mom died in hospice. And totally understand that.
I think some of the grief, too, for me was that it wasn't just my father's passing. It was my father beginning his dementia journey. And spending 8 years on the roller coaster ride of up and down and up and down. And I remember we would ask that nurse that you were talking about, we would ask him, "So what should we expect?" And he would say, "He hasn't decided it's time to go yet." And even nurses that we talked to, hospice nurses when he was in hospice back in a different town before we moved here. And the same thing. You know, they come and go in and out, and sometimes they get stronger and they get released off of hospice. And then they something changes and they come back in. Well, that's a whole grief process. "Oh, I think we're getting better." No, your dad's not getting better. But it would feel like he was getting better, and maybe I'm going to get the old one back. And then no, it's just the dementia continuing to progress. So there's grief in that process, not just in the final ending, but in the up and down process of, like, how do I navigate that? So those are, I think it's complicated, which is why we're here.
And also, like, maybe you're not experiencing grief right now. Maybe you don't have a loved one who you've lost. Or, again, we don't want to just talk about death. We want to talk about things like, losing a big job or divorce.
Didn't get the job you wanted.
Or like a story you will tell later in other podcasts about being sued and kind of your credibility kind of attacked.
Yeah. And how about the grief of you become an empty nester, like you and your spouse become empty nesters because all the kids have now graduated from high school and they've gone on to school or a career or a trade or whatever they're doing, and now the house is quiet, and it's the first time it's been quiet in 25 years.
And now experiencing who you are again.
And who am I as a non-parenting parent?
Yeah.
My children are adults now.
Yeah.
And there's I think grief in that.
Yeah.
So I think there's grief in all kinds of things.
Yeah. But also I want to say was, maybe you're not experiencing any of those kind of things. That doesn't speak to anything I'm doing or in my life and something like that. But what I say too is, maybe you have a loved one, like maybe you have a friend or a loved one or, a coworker or someone who is experiencing those kind of things. I know I always felt like, I don't know what to say to those people. Like they lost someone, I don't know what to say to them and stuff like that. And through my grief, I could say, I wish someone just called me and said, hey, you want to grab some coffee? I know your mom passed. Like, what's happening.
Yeah.
I wish someone just say, hey, come grab some coffee. Let's just talk. Let's just something like that. And maybe this helps you help other people who in your life are experiencing grief, and you can be there for them. And like, it's okay to ask them for coffee.
Yeah.
It's not, maybe you don't have to have those kid gloves on and say, oh, I can't talk to them. Or I don't want to experience that kind of stuff and stuff like that. I think it can help in so many ways.
Yeah.
That
I've had people say, I wish I had called you.
Yeah.
I should have.
Right.
I didn't.
Yeah.
And I feel I regret that I did not.
Yeah.
And I should have. And I know now that I will in the future if this happens to someone else, whatever the traumatic episode was that I experienced, they said I should have reached out to you and I didn't.
Yeah.
And I regret that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that means moving forward, then reach out to people.
Yeah.
And I think I've heard it said before in the case of any of these things, as you say, sometimes it's just nice to say, hey, you want to go grab a cup of coffee?
Yeah.
And when I go and do that with people, when I reach out and say, hey, you want to go grab a cup of coffee? I don't have to mention anything about the event.
Right.
About whatever their loss event was, whatever their grief event was. I don't have to bring it up because what happens? They bring it up.
Yeah.
If they feel safe enough with me while we're having a cup of coffee and talking about things, they will bring it up if they want to talk about it.
Absolutely.
I'm not a therapist, not my job to go digging in their life, but if they want to talk about it, oftentimes they're not looking for advice. They just want someone to talk to who's not going to judge them.
Right.
And so, wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
Just somebody to reach out.
Yeah.
And say, hey, want to go grab a cup of coffee?
Yeah.
Easy as that.
Yeah. And neither one of us are therapists, and we're not diagnosing people, and we're not coming through with medical information and to help, but we hope through experiences and through discussions and hard topics and some funny topics and some interesting topics and from other people, not just talking about it, but who have lived it.
Yeah.
We hope that those stories and those conversations will help others who are like us, who are not like us, who are just trying to learn how to navigate these, messy waters.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, so I look forward to seeing everybody on the next one.
Yeah.
And next week we'll have a new thing. We might have a guest in the next couple of weeks.
Right.
And be able to talk about stuff from their perspective.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
So thanks for checking out our podcast and taking a listen. And we hope to see you again on a future show.
And if this is something you like, then comment down below, like this, share it around. But also, in the comment section, talk about things that maybe topics you want us to talk about. Maybe messy topics that you don't want to talk about, or you don't like talking about around Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah.
But these are topics that, hey, I just want someone to kind of look into and talk about and, learn something from it. Thank you for listening to Decoding Grief with Andrew and Gary. We look forward to sharing our next episode with you. And remember, when it comes to grief, you are not alone.